Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality. Welcome to the webinar on the employee experience, a strategic approach. And thank you for joining us on this webinar. It's a topic that's been in the news for quite a few years now, and it seems to crop up in many of the companies that we talk to. Scott and I are going to be the two presenters today. And Scott and I think OV in general has a reputation of not simply doing what everybody else is doing, at least not unless there's a good reason. And the same is going to be true with today's session. We're going to go a bit off road from how the employee experience is often talked about, and to help you think through what is strategic about the employee experience at your own organization. So what are our goals in taking this approach? Our goal is to help you connect more strongly to your executive leadership team, to pique their interest in the data you're bringing to bear, to help make the employee listening work that you do more impactful. And to do that, we feel you have to take a strategic approach to your employee surveys. And this is an approach that OrgVitality takes in all of its work. Today, we're going to talk about how to do that with the employee experience in mind. We hopefully will stimulate some of your thinking on this topic, give you a few ideas, and hopefully a few good ideas and concepts that you can take back to your organization. As I mentioned, I'm Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality, and I'll be joined today by one of the co-founders of the firm and the head of our consulting practice, Dr. Scott Brooks. Scott?
Yeah, hi everybody. Pleasure to be here. And I'm going to kick us off with an observation about employee experience. It's clearly important. That's not in question. But sometimes, and with a lot of topics that risks becoming a fad or getting faddish, sometimes the enthusiasm to embrace employee experience runs a little amok. So for example, has anybody heard, there's a statement that's floating out there that's pretty easily Googleable, that organizations that invest in employee experience outperform peers by 147% in earnings per share. Now that's a very specific number, and it's a bold statement, and it sounds causal. And as a scientist, which I am, I wanted to do a little bit of research. So if you dig into this specific question, where does this come from? First of all, Workday said it. They quoted KPMG. All right. You go upstream, and KPMG actually got it from HBR, the Harvard Business Review. And it turns out that was not an article, but it was a blog post that was actually citing Gallup. And Gallup was actually talking about their specific definition of engagement. So what does this mean? It means that we've left the concept of employee experience behind, however you want to define it, and have converged on Gallup's specific version of engagement. And that was about a dozen years ago or so. And I know this research that Gallup did, and I've reviewed it and looked at it and gone through it and tossed through it. And there's a lot of good things that we can say about it, but this specific research that generated this quote is probably better interpreted as successful organizations are better places to work than unsuccessful ones. So that original research doesn't really support the basic 147% in earnings per share that about organizational investment. As scientists, as workers in organizations, as talent management or other kinds of professionals, we all know that definitions matter. What we're trying to measure matters. And so the origin of this statement was not employee experience, but Gallup's definition of engagement. And in fact, only KPMG really did much to define what employee experience is. Jeff mentioned a workbook. And the first question that we're going to ask, does your organization have a formal or informal definition of the employee experience?
Write down the definition of the employee experience in your company. So what is the employee experience, right? The employee experience, it's a bit of an ink blot. And, if you look various sources, you come up with all sorts of different definitions of what the employee experience is. In essence, it can be what anybody wants it to be. The Topics include things like the employee experience is about transaction, things like the recruiting experience or onboarding experience or retention or exiting, or how does when they submit a benefits claim or any other transactional kind of activity in the organization. That's the employee experience. Other people would say the employee experience is dealing with the pay and benefits and perks they might receive, which is the equity experience in the company. Am I treated fairly for the amount of effort I put in? Do I get a commensurate rewards? Others would say the employee experience is about aspirations, such as career goals and development or job experiences. Others say the employee experience is about life events, which could include things like do they have pride in the organization or satisfaction or engagement, or other events such as leaving for maternity leave or coming back from a leave of absence. Others would say it's day-to-day workplace cultural experiences, such as do I feel valued? Do I feel listened to? Am I receiving mentoring, et cetera, et cetera? And others would say the employee experience is about the work process experiences, such as team formations or reorganizations or effective processes or frustrations or my ability to get the job done, and maybe even safety. So safety is at the bottom of the list. It's often not thought of in the same breath as some of these other topics as being part of the employee experience. But I don't think anybody on the call today would argue with me that how people perceive safety, whether it's a safe environment to work, whether safety is emphasized, et cetera, is an important cultural variable and is part of the employee experience, especially when you get into manufacturing organizations. So it's an ink blot. It could be everything. And what happens if it's everything and everything is being emphasized, it's sort of a nothing, right? So when you look at employee experience, you have to look at your organization and what aspects of employee experience are important to measure in this organization at this moment in time. So let's take a quick look, or a closer look, I should say, at safety that was listed at the bottom of the previous chart. How does something like safety become strategic? How does it impact the employee experience? And perhaps, does it have some unexpected benefits? Let's use a case study of Alcoa and how Alcoa treated the employee experience. Some of you may have heard about this before, and for others, it may be new. But in 1987, which is almost ancient history at this point, Alcoa was struggling with market share, with product quality and profitability. They brought in a new CEO, Paul O'Neill, whose first board meeting with the board of Alcoa and with investors has become legendary. Paul explains, I knew I had to transform Alcoa. I decided I was going to start by focusing on one thing. I intended to make Alcoa the safest company in America. I intended to go for zero injuries. Well, the board was sort of aghast, and the investors certainly were aghast. They were saying, no, we want to hear about what you're going to do about, product delivery or profitability and things like that. And Paul's response is, you're not listening to me. If you want to know how Alcoa is doing, you're going to ask me about safety. So he went against what his board wanted. He went against what the investors wanted. He started installing safety procedures with on-the-job instructions, safety checklists, task management, safety leaderboards, resulting in a progressive and transformative culture, right? Alcoa, in terms of their lost workdays per injury, went from 1.86 lost workdays per injury per 100 workers to 0.2 lost workdays per injury per 100 workers. So the amount of injuries, in other words, how safe were they working, dropped enormously. In fact, it dropped much more than any one of his management team said it was possible to do. What happened to Alcoa as they went through that? Alcoa's market value increased from 3 billion to 27 billion. Net income increased from 200 million to 1.484 billion. by focusing on one single habit, worker safety. And remember, these are 1987 dollars. Right? By the way, later on, Paul would become Treasury Secretary of the United States. So admittedly, important topics can't be ignored. But if you're focusing on the strategic elements of your employee experience, you're not aligning to corporate strategy. You're not maximizing the chances of corporate success, and you're not going to be maximizing executive interests in the results, and the whole concepts of the employee experience is nothing more than a feel-good exercise. So by not focusing on strategy, you could also be sending a message that the corporate strategy is not important, taking a back seat to what your safety or your survey consultants deems important or what you deem important. So let's talk about strategy a little bit, and let's also talk about how did safety become strategic in Alcoa? So Scott, what really is strategy?
Well, strategy is the thing that you want to focus on. And you can also focus on what's important, but in order to determine and to identify what's in this middle, this inset circle, you need to ask a basic question, which is what Jeff was saying, which is, what is strategy? And we're not talking about ignoring what's important. We're talking about an extra focus on what is strategic. And this is going to be a theme that we hammer throughout this webinar, that strategic is not synonymous with important. Yeah, in hallway conversations, we use this all the time. It's like, hey, let's be strategic about this, or that's a strategic topic. I'm not talking about conversationally what strategy means. I am kicking it up a few notches in discipline to, Michael Porter level, Harvard Business Review level descriptions about what strategic means. And we're talking strategy at an organizational level primarily. And one of Porter's big messages is, don't confuse strategy with operational excellence, right? So what is strategic is different than how well you do something. And that's a really important distinction. And we've developed 3 guidelines to help you tease that apart. The first is, to be strategic is to be unique. It's true, you will never be a better version of your competition than they are. They got there first, you can only play catch up. And strategies, technically defined, focus on factors that competitors find it costly or impossible to copy. That's really important. So you are trying to maximize your competitive differentiation, and you cannot do that without being unique. Even nonprofits are trying to do something unique. They're trying to do something a little bit different in the space that they're trying to support. So I use the word competitive a lot, but all of these concepts do still apply to nonprofits or other non-competitive situations. So given that, one of the implications is that off-the-shelf approaches are not strategic and don't provide a competitive advantage, right? If you're doing something generic, it's not unique. If you're doing something that worked elsewhere with your competitors, it's not going to elevate you above your competitors. They don't support that secret sauce that makes you you. Second guideline is that strategy is about choices, and they suggest pursuing certain paths over others, directly addressing your challenges and your bottlenecks. Do you turn left or right? Do you develop distribution in India or double down on internet sales? These are choices that help you define how you're going to be successful, not just what kind of success you achieve. And the implication here is that strategy is not synonymous with success. Rather, it defines how to become successful. And accordingly, strategies need to suggest how to achieve those goals or ambitions. They are not the goal or not the ambition themselves, right? So what's the implication here? Increasing market share, customer loyalty, more money in the bank. These are ambitions, not goals, not strategic goals, right? And they are may be the same as engagement. Engagement doesn't actually suggest what choice to do. You can think of maybe being an employer of choice or reducing turnover. These are great things to pursue, but they are not inherently strategic. So how do we relate all of this to the employee experience? Well, first, we're going to send you to your workbook again. Note some highlights of your organization's strategy and where it's going and how it will get there. Don't just list, we want to be a $2 billion company or a $7 billion company, or don't just list, we need to reduce turnover or be high in engagement. Those are aspirations. Those are not things that help you choose which way you go. And we're going to kind of shortcut to the workbook's prompts 3 and 4. Note alongside these, if you can, any critical objectives that your organization's working on. This year might be the year of quality, or something like that for you. And emphasize which are unique and which support your competitive edge. So which of all of these strategies and critical objectives help differentiate you from your competition? Jeff?
So what is strategic with respect to the employee experience, right? I don't think anyone would argue that improving safety changed the employee experience, right? People like to go home from work in one piece. And so getting people to feel like they were working in a safe environment is going to make them feel better about that environment. But it worked its magic for Alcoa because it was also strategic, right? Every company out there emphasizes safety in one way, shape, or form, right? But how does it become strategic, right? And this is, we're using safety here as simply as an example. There's many other things that your own companies could pick. It doesn't have to be something like safety. But safety at Alcoa was a strategic differentiator for both the company and the employees that required a cultural shift, resulting in greatly improved performance. Improving safety changed the employee experience. Improving safety required working more carefully, which yielded higher quality, which yielded more customer satisfaction, which yielded greater market share, which yielded better financial performance. And in fact, Alcoa became dominant in its market, all because it focused on safety. So it wasn't that safety was not important before, but he took it to the next level. And emphasizing safety, working in a safe fashion, it was a thread that had many other factors that came along for the ride because they were working in a safe environment. So how do we determine, right, which employee experiences are strategic for your organization? It may not be safety, right? It could be, but it may not be. And if you can define what's strategic for your organization, these are going to improve your survey items if you're asking about them correctly. In other words, you're defining what is strategic, and that's what's going to be one of the things that's going to be emphasized in your employee survey. And it will have beneficial impacts to both the employee and the organization. Let's explore that a little bit, how you define those things.
Yeah. So coming back to this particular diagram, now strategic is not synonymous with important, but it nestles within it. The question that Jeff posed is really, how do we define what's in that smaller strategic circle? And so part of that question is, what's strategic versus merely important? And whether you knew it or not, this is the part of the webinar that you've all been waiting for. This is the game show part of the program. And so we're going to play a little game, Jeff, if you're ready, called Strategic or Not. First one is safety. Jeff, strategic or not?
Well, you probably can guess the answer, right? Safety is critical. It's especially critical if you're working in a manufacturing environment or other kind of environment that is sort of physically related. But is it strategic? It's only strategic if you're taking it in the approach that Alcoa took it. In other words, safety is going to be a linchpin that's going to make many other good things happen in the organization. For most organizations, no, it's not strategic. How about engagement, Scott? Is engagement strategic? Employee engagement.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to say generally no. Engagement does not provide unique insights into the challenges that your organization is facing. Is it important? Sure. It's like gas in the tank, but it's not unique or special to you. It's something that everybody wants to do. All right, Jeff, related. What about retention? Is retention strategic?
One of the things we've been hearing about fairly recently is more and more companies are saying they can point to the people who are at risk for leaving. They can, through an employee survey, and we've done that for literally decades, I would say. But is retention itself strategic, or is it a tactic? So think of what would be strategic with respect to retention. Something that would be strategic would be keeping the critical skill sets inside the company that are needed, right? And so measuring retention in terms of, are we losing people who are critical to the successful functioning of the company? And then measuring retention could make it strategic. But simply measuring retention and saying we're at risk for 8% or 10% turnover, whatever, that by itself is not strategic. Unless you're throwing it against, are we able to retain the talent that we need to be successful, right? And by that definition, not all retention is created equal, right? There are some positions that are more critical to the success of the company than others, right? So having one overall retention score doesn't quite do it in terms of creating a strategic retention metric. So for many organizations, simply measuring retention is not strategic, but preserving competencies required to execute on the organization's strategic plan would in fact make it strategic. How about onboarding, Scott?
Well, you might be picking up on a little bit of a theme here. I'm going to say no. Onboarding is not inherently strategic. But if you're in a super fast growth organization and you need to bring new talent up to speed in order to expand your distribution into India, or in order to innovate on a particular kind of a thing or something like that, then maybe bringing new talent up to speed is the strategic piece of it, and specific talent up to speed. And so maybe that could be strategic. But onboarding, no, not inherently strategic. Jeff, what about compliance climate?
Similarly, right? Just measuring compliance climate again is not strategic, but if you're a financial services company navigating new Department of Labor regulations, it can rise to the top of the list if what you don't want to do is step over the line of how you're supposed to be operating as an organization. You need to be in compliance, right, to be successful as an organization. So that, in fact, would make it strategic. How about managerial skills, Scott, or recognition, or career growth, service orientation, innovation, or efficiency? Any of those?
You all probably guessed it. I'm going to say no. And this is picking up on the theme that strategy or being strategic is not inherent in the topic itself. That's a dependent question, and it's dependent on your organization, your leaders, and the intentions of what you're trying to do. Here's kind of an extreme example. Is air strategic? No. It's important for sure. If we didn't have air to breathe, not a single one of us would be coming to work today. But is it strategic? Well, if you're working on the moon, or you happen to be in Navy's SEAL Team 6, maybe management of breathable oxygen is strategic if it's a differentiator between you and your competitive field. But those are very specific situations. But even oxygen could be strategic if that's your scene. So, you know, we're coming to a basic question. It's like, can they all be strategic? And some could, maybe not, but no, they can't all be strategic, at least not in the same time. So, how do we begin to weave through what's strategic? We know it's not the topic itself that's inherently strategic, it's that special fit between the topic and your organization. So, how do you figure that out? Couple of pieces of advice. First, don't start with important topics and then try to figure out which are strategic. You could, that's logical, but you're going to get bogged down because it's hard to set aside or demote just fractionally a super important topic just because it's not strategic. So instead, start with the end in mind. Start with a strategy first mindset, which will lead you to the one or two ways where you and your organization are trying to rise above the rest. Generally, that means talking about the organizational strategy, not HR strategy. HR strategy ought to be subordinate to the organization strategy. HR strategy, by the way, is sort of a special case of determining important things for listening programs and so forth. We'll touch on that a little bit as we go, but most of the time here, we're talking about organizational strategy and what sets you apart. And to help figure this out, what is strategic? Here's some acid test questions once you've got a topic. An element of employee experience is more likely to be strategic if A, the topic originated from the core interests of executives, kind of top down. B, you are paradigm busting versus simply looking to improve. Where are you looking to invent something new that didn't quite exist in the same way before? Next, fewer than a handful of topics may be declared strategic. One or two is great, three, maybe, more than that, and you just might run into trouble. And then next, it's central to what the organization is trying to achieve. It's already part of the conversations amongst leadership and employees throughout your organization. Now, an element of employee experience is less likely to be strategic if the topic originated from traditional HR topics. These can be super important. Employee relations is always going to be important. Strategic, less likely to be so. It's less likely to be important also if you're looking for efficient best practice improvements rather than inventing something new or paradigm busting. It's also less likely to be a strategic if it's part of a half dozen or more kinds of topics. So let's review this and how they fit with Alcoa's definition of employee experience and strategy. Jeff? So
part of the acid test of how critical this part of the employee experience is central to what the organization is trying to accomplish. So if it's central, then it can in fact rise to the level of being strategic. So while safety is important, improving safety as a way of improving quality increasing customer satisfaction and market share, in fact, make it strategic. So was the topic originated from core interests of executives? Yes, of course. Is it paradigm busting? They were trying to achieve safety records that no one else had achieved. So yes. Was it fewer than a handful of topics? Yes, it was in fact a singular topic. It was safety above all else. And is it central to what the organization is trying to achieve? Yes, of course. So if an element, as we said, an element is less likely to be strategic, did safety originate, for instance, from traditional HR topics in Alcoa? A question mark there, because sometimes safety does go through HR, and other times it's a whole separate department. And are you looking for efficient best practice improvements? Nope, that's not what they were about. And did they have a half a dozen or more of these strategic things? No, again, it was singularly focused. So improving business top line by introducing new products or moving into new geographies can be strategic. Surveys can measure, for instance, the confidence that employees have in achieving these goals. then the survey is in fact becoming more strategic. When Scott and I or one of our consultants sit down with a client, the first thing we do is, do you have strategy documents? Can we look at them? And then you say, if these are the strategy documents, how can you operationalize them into employee survey questions? So let's look at a couple of case studies about how that might happen. Scott?
Yep. Yeah. I think one of the themes that we've got here is that there's no way around it, no way around thinking about it all uniquely for your situation. Said more simply, you can't copy each other's homework. And related to homework, here's our next workbook prompt. Think about elements of employee experience in your organization and what parts are strategic. And so this is really combining some of the things you would have written at the top part of your page. And again, to help you, things are more likely to be strategic, the elements of employee experience, if they originate from core interests, paradigm busting, few topics, and central, and less likely to be if it's just originated from a traditional HR topic, looking for best practice improvements, and a half dozen or more. So we'll give you a minute to think through what you've been sketching out on your page. We're going to be moving from this into more explicit advice about managing listening programs and survey work, and then get into a couple of case studies. But if you think about what we're trying to do with listening programs, it's we like to use this three-part model: strategy, insight, and action. Strategy is where you articulate your purpose. What are you really trying to achieve? Insight is, you collect data, share results. It's a lot of the machinery. And action is you create change. And from all of our work, if we were to think about these three things, one big lesson learned across decades of having done this stuff is that strategy is where you start. Strategy and action. What are you trying to get done, and how are you going to act to change that? And insight, the green circle, should follow. We all know this, but sometimes it can be so compelling to become smitten by some technique or some survey instrument or a particular model that has research of being effective elsewhere. And that's important stuff. We are not saying those aren't important. Absolutely important. But they're just not quite as strategic as something that you build yourself, or you get somebody to help you build it for you and your situation. So with that in mind, let's look at a couple of things regarding the employee experience. And sometimes these elements are known as moments that matter, right? You can think about like trying to get into different touch points. And so there are some mechanical kinds of places, and just to address, and we're talking about that green circle. But once you figured out strategy and the kind of action, how do you start to build your mechanics? Number one, leverage annual surveys. And lots of folks may feel like continuous listening or passive listening is a little bit more of a modern focus. But the first thing to be done here is to align your concepts, analyses, and action appliements to your strategic elements of employee experience. There is a lot of research about continuous listening, and it's great. And there's a lot that can be done here. But if you look at a lot of the research on the action side of things, it's hard for people to continuously act unless it's your day job. Like if you are a safety coordinator, you want daily information about safety, and that's great. But other than that, it's kind of hard. You want to make sure that any kind of continuous listening types of things are aligned with people's actions. So a spinal cord of an annual survey, a once a year New Year's resolution kind of thing is usually where you start. And by the way, there's a lot of research on New Year's resolutions, and annual resolutions are 10 times more effective than resolutions made at any other time of the year. And that's the kind of research you want to lean into, not just new techniques. But once you've got that annual survey, then you can extend into other moments. Onboarding exit surveys, they make solid foundations to identify unique moments, especially in pivotal populations. And they can be generic, but that can be important and super useful. But essentially, too, think about other unique moments in your organization, like new product launches or customer interactions or mergers and acquisitions or return to office policies that are announced. And even, this week there's new big organizations that are trying to figure out how to navigate return to office kinds of policies. These are special moments that impact employees. Then what you want to do is you want to widen the sense of matter, of moments that matter beyond just employee-centric concerns. Performance-centric or strategy-centric observations are not simply more valuable a lot of the time, but they're definitely more predictive. So the single best predictor of customer loyalty is service climate. That can be measured in a survey. That's not engagement. That's asking about the exercise of delivering service. Similarly, the best predictor of safety and safety metrics is safety climate. The best innovation for innovation is innovation climate. The best predictor for X is X climate. Engagement itself does okay, but it's a watered down version of everything. And as such, it's never going to be the best predictor of any one thing. And once you widen that a little bit, then you want to crystallize assignments that people get based off of data. Dashboards don't create change, people do. So what kinds of assignments are you trying to drive? What kinds of information will let them do what and when, and all these kinds of things are things you can figure out. Even exit survey data, that's a continuous flow. It's always happening. But people don't act on exit survey data continuously. They act more in chunks or spurts. So how do you help craft the rhythm for people to step back and spend the time to look at exit survey data? That's important. That's the action-centric way to think about it. Then once you have all that, then you can work out some ongoing machinery, some continuous listening, some passive listening, all those other kinds of things. But there is a building that needs to happen. Now, all this is great in concept, but let's look at a couple of examples. And these examples are going to help us as we try to pin down what we're going to look at. And these are client examples that we've worked with. So number one, a tech company is emerging from dependence on venture capital funding. And what they've done is they created a new sales strategy that demanded client co-creation of solutions and a lot of cross-functional delivery between service people, salespeople, their technical engineers, and so forth. So you can start to imagine the kind of employee experience indicators that would help you identify how are you doing on this new sales strategy. And in fact, the survey content itself included a lot of collaboration and creativity, particularly with customer-facing folks. And that was also identified partly upstream, but partly in the survey. What kind of customer touch do you have? And those folks were targeted for, sales, service engineers, and so forth. So the content changed, but also the analysis, the focus, the executive presentation, the action priorities, all of that also correspondingly changed to help focus on the new strategy. Here's another example, a financial services organization, and Jeff kind of alluded to this earlier when we were talking about compliance climate, but there was an organization that was wrong in its legacy of customer service. Anything the customer wants, yes, we'll make it happen. We'll figure it out. But there were emerging Department of Labor regulations that required certain compliance. And you can kind of picture it that a compliance authority saying you have to do this, you can't do that, that's a little at odds with the general spirit of, hey, whatever the customer wants. And these two things don't always paddle in the same direction. And so, of course, the survey needed a compliance climate set of items, basically a dimension on compliance and how that's managed, and a service climate element. And those two things together could be examined as the parts of employee experience that were most critical for this transition. In fact, in this organization, this was struck home because some of the executives said that 75% of all of their board conversations, 75% of all of that airtime was devoted to these upcoming Department of Labor regulations. So how do we do that? How do we make an organization that remains attached to its service legacy, but still, stays within the confounds of the United States Department of Labor? All right. Next, we have an organization that was seriously growing, and they needed people on board in the right ways. And so this fast up to speed element in especially pivotal innovation positions was super important. So this starts to touch on more traditional employee life cycle kinds of things you can see, but it was not aimed at improving the life cycle itself, although that was great, that was important. It was aimed at trying to ramp up those competencies and those capabilities in those positions and not losing that on the back end through turnover. So that was the pivotal issue. So of course, you might imagine that new employee experience and retention in key jobs became the focus of the listening program. Importantly, this is not just asking new employees or exiting employees, why are you joining, why are you leaving, but also asking existing employees, how do we all help the newbies come up to speed faster and so forth. And so there's a lot going on there, and a lot that you can start to imagine was part of this particular program. Executives are never so interested in life cycle when it's this, unless it's this kind of a case. One last example, a hospitality chain wanted to open hot. Now, opening hot, if you're in hospitality, is on that grand opening weekend, a certain occupancy rate actually predicts the slope of revenue faster than a lot of other metrics, right? So how do you maximize the occupancy rate on that grand opening weekend? Well, leading up to that, you want confident and enthusiastic staff, but you also want them to tell you about glitches so you can diagnose and treat them. So you can picture a pattern like this of ongoing or weekly touch bases to different samples across all of the people responsible for bringing a grand opening into being, and ask them questions like, are we going to open gracefully on time? If not, why not? Now, there's a little bit more to it, but that's kind of the essence. It's important that while this example is referring to hospitality and opening a hotel, which we can all kind of imagine what that looks like, this translates. You can map this onto product launches, a drug discovery. You can map it into space launches, whatever you want. Whenever you have a big moment coming up in the future that needs to go well, and a lot of people doing a lot of things to bring that about, that's where this kind of thing can help. Now, key point, importantly, all of these listening programs covered more than just the critical few strategic priorities. We're not saying disregard important stuff. We're saying extra focus on the strategic issues, and those are what your programs spin around more than anything else, right? So in that way, we are saying don't disregard the important, but focus mostly on the strategic priorities.
So to emphasize what Scott just said, what about the just plain important? I don't want you to come away from this thinking that the only good employee survey is one that's focused on strategy and nothing else. There's a lot of other things that may need to be covered. If you examine what's going on in an organization before you put, pen to paper to write survey items. So things like, where's my career going? Or am I getting the training I need? Or do I hear, communications about important things in a timely fashion? Those things may not be strategic, but they could be critically important. Those fundamentals could be unrelated to a competitive edge, but they still may need work, right? You still may need to help people or improve on job postings or improve on creating development plans for people or improve on the performance appraisal system. A second category is there could be, values-based or moral imperatives that can be critical to define who you are. Things about the philanthropy orientation of the company, or things about DEI, or things about other value-based or moral imperatives. They may not be tied to a strategic plan that the company is doing, but they define who the company is from a values-based or moral perspective. HR has a role to champion the concerns of employees and listen to these programs. But you also want to make sure you focus on things that will have a strategic impact. So you don't want to go all one way or all the other, right? And one outcome that is your focus survey or other measurement will feel true. So an outcome of this approach is that your survey or measurement will feel true and more relevant to your employees, and by definition, will be somewhat unique to your organization. Another important outcome is you're more likely to achieve greater engagement with the senior executive team because you're giving them feedback on what they're trying to accomplish with the organization. In other words, you're telling them from an employee's perspective, what is enabling our strategy to be successful and what's getting in the way.
Yeah. And I think those are great points. And one thing to leave you with as we begin to approach our overall summary is that it's okay for your aspirations to exceed your grasp. As you think about some of these things, corporate strategy, maybe HR strategy, not everybody has access to what executives are actually thinking. Not everybody's in a place, and maybe some organizations' HR is not even in a place to direct new programs that really tie to strategy. And these things that we're talking about are hard. They require a certain cross-functional, higher level consultative approach of business orientation in order to really connect to strategy. And our goal here is not to say things that frustrate people and talk about things that people can't actually make happen. Sometimes you can't make something happen. If your survey is about to go live in 2 weeks or 2 months, you might not be able to change things. That's okay. But you need to think about where you want to go and have that aspiration exceed your grasp. The alternative is not thinking past your current situation and not trying to connect to strategy. And that's really not that's a sub-optimized situation to be in. So we like to say, do what you can do, think past what you currently do towards what you think would be fantastic, and maybe figure out a couple of steps that'll help you make some progress. But don't worry about swallowing it all at once. And this takes us to a summary. So in order to help you pin down all the prime messages and prime points here, Jeff?
So I think the first takeaway from all this is the employee experience is the way it's defined across many, many different organizations. It's a bit of an ink blot. It's vague with no consistent focus. I think the second sort of takeaway is while a great deal can be important, right? Not all things that are important are strategic, right? A third takeaway would be organizational strategy is unique, with guided choices to set you apart from the competition. And by definition, then, your survey, when an employee picks up your survey and reads it, they're going to say, I understand why you're asking me this, because this is tied to what we're trying to do as a organization. So the survey will be unique, and the organization strategy will be reflected in that unique survey.
Yeah. Picking up on that point, we sometimes kid around that if we were to take everybody in the audience here and all of your surveys and so forth, and we were to spill them into the middle of the room, could you pick each one up and reassign it back to the person or the company where it was supposed to come from? Or do they all look the same? And, our point of view here is that they ought to have the language and the resonance so that an informed observer could pick them up and deliver them back to the person that dropped it. But what do you do with all this? We've started to allude to some of these points, which is identify the 1 to 2 elements of the employee experience that are required for strategic execution in your organization. And then you want to design those listening programs to focus on those. Yes, you want to measure other important factors, but you focus on those key elements. And you also want to design for action, not simply insight, particularly at the executive level of your organization. The more you know about what executives want to do, the better it is. What comes next? Workbook, just sort of setting up prompt 5, which you'll do on your own, which is how to think about the 2 to 3 organizational efforts most strategic in your organization and match them to employee experience. And you can review your listening programs to see if your strategy is currently reflected. And whether these listening programs are surveys, pulses, or other avenues, but try to make sure that they're all in support and help those kinds of things. So with that, submit a question, top takeaways in the Zoom chat or in the Q&A, and we can answer any questions that have emerging in the couple minutes we have left.
So Scott, here's one question that came up. Are we suggesting that a company with an existing survey just sort of throw it all out and start over? Or could they evolve over time to a survey that picks up on more strategic themes?
Yeah, well, you don't want to throw anything away, at least something that's not been successful in the past. But if you're looking at a survey that maybe hasn't captured the imagination of executives to the extent that you want it to, maybe there's something more you can do. You can add a couple of items, or maybe you can look at certain segments of your population. One thing that's true from a employee experience point of view sometimes is that we feel that all employees are equal. Now, that is absolutely true when you're talking about fairness and equity and justice and things like that. But if you're talking about an organizational strategy, not all employees are going to be equal informants of things that are required to achieve that strategy. Like if you're trying to increase distribution in India, go look at India, or supply chain people, or whatever it is that helps make that happen. If you're growing really fast, look at the competencies as representing your organization and what you might need and what you might be losing to unfortunate turnover. There's a lot of segmentation you can do with any existing survey that can be important. You don't always have to change survey content, but work towards that. Work towards making sure you've got those strategic components in your survey content.
Okay, I think we're really just about out of time. Scott, do you have any final thoughts or words you'd like to pass out?
I think it would just be, give serious thought to this importance versus strategic kind of differentiation. And strategic is going to be unique for you. Importance can be generic and well-researched and well-known and talked about, lots of best practices. That's great. But don't let the uniqueness part of strategic topics scare you away. You need to lean into that. And even if it's not been done elsewhere, you're inventing something yourself, that's strategic, and that's hard. But that's what helps the organizations the most.